Today I'd like to speak to you about one of the four constitutions of the Second Vatican Council, the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes. This unique text, which was promulgated in 1965, is emblematic, perhaps more than any other of the Council's teachings, of the Catholic Church's turn towards the world, of a new stance, a new sense of the Catholic Church's mission and responsibility in the modern world. So to begin, I'd like to begin reflecting on some of the features of the social and historical context within which the Council itself met. What were the ideas that were on the minds of the bishops as they traveled to Rome each year from 1962 to 1965 to deliberate on these questions and to reflect on the responsibilities and the mission of the Church in the modern world? The Council was called by Pope John XXIII in January of 1959 during the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. From 1960 to 62, there was an intensive period of preparation. And beginning in October of 1962, the bishops would travel to Rome each fall for 3 months, where they would deliberate together and debate on these documents. One of the questions or issues that John XXIII brought to the attention of the Catholic bishops was what he called one of the signs of the times to which the Church needs to attend in the modern world, and that is the growing recognition of the dignity of the human person. When we think back to the social and historical context of this period, we might remember the civil rights movement. There was great organized movements for nonviolent action to promote the equal recognition of African Americans or of black members and colored participants in South African society. So the civil rights movement is an important sign of this recognition of the dignity of the human person. We could also recall the feminist movement. We date the second wave of feminist thought to the early 1960s, and some of us can recall, again, civil rights marches in support of the rights of women and the search for the equal recognition and participation of women in the structures of society and also in the life of the Church. There was talk in this period, beginning from the late 1960s and into the early 70s in international affairs, of a new world order. One of the movements or institutions that's symbolic of this desire to establish a new world order was the founding of the United Nations. The United Nations in 1948 already had signed and developed a universal declaration of human rights. So there was a recognition of the need for new international structures to address these questions of human rights, but also to avoid conflict and war. In this period, we also see, because of growing technological progress, means of communication and transportation, an unprecedented migration of peoples, which also is expressed in the shift of people from living in rural societies to urban communities. That movement has only accelerated in the last 50 years, and it's created societies that are more pluralistic than we've ever seen before, characterized by ethnic and religious pluralism and by the breakdown of old class structures. Another characteristic of that context was the development of new technologies. We've already mentioned that a little bit, but this new means of technology and exploitation of the world's resources gave many people new access to the goods of the earth and to a new form of prosperity. But at the same time, it brought about growing inequality, new inequities in the social fabric of the human community. And so the bishops at Vatican II were very conscious of the growing gap between rich and poor. In discussions about this New World Order, they were concerned to promote development, but also to avoid underdevelopment, to look for ways of promoting development, forms of development and new societies that would be of the benefit for all people, so that all people could share in this new prosperity. And so they needed to recall a theme that emerges in this document, Gaudium et Spes, the notion of the common good. And they say in the document, Gaudium et Spes, that we're beginning to experience the need to focus on the common good, not only in individual societies, but also at a more universal and international level. And so there's this awareness of systemic structures of underdevelopment, systemic structures that really promote and bring about, create poverty for great masses of the human community. So some of the bishops, led by Dom Helder Camara, who was the Archbishop of the Diocese of Olinda and Recife in Brazil, began to promote the idea of a poor church that would be at the service of the poor. We hear these themes repeated today in the discourse of Pope Francis. Another important theme that emerges in the document Gaudium et Spes, but was very much on the minds of the human community in the 1960s, was the questions of war and peace, and as we saw, the international order. The bishops at Vatican II meet less than a generation after the close of the Second World War, and that brought about a terrible, terrible destruction and devastation, not only on the European continent, but in the Pacific region, in the Middle East, throughout North Africa. We saw also the terrible genocide of the Jewish community. So this experience also raised the question of the Church's attitude towards the Jews and people of other religious traditions. Many Christians from the European continent had very heavy hearts after the experience of the Second World War, and they did a lot of soul searching. They were wondering how so-called Christian societies could be engaged in this kind of destructive violence. The Council meets at the height of the Cold War. In 1961, again, in the wake of the Second World War, the Russian army was occupying sections of eastern Germany, and they began to build a wall, an iron curtain, to separate East Germany and West Germany, or the countries of the Soviet bloc from Western Europe. And in 1962, several days after the bishops began their deliberations in Rome at the council, the Russian government began to deploy a series of atomic missiles on the island of Cuba aimed at the United States. And so there was this terrible crisis and blockade around the island of Cuba going on behind in the world's theater where the bishops were meeting. And so these questions were very much on their mind. And we'll hear that Gaudium et Spes devotes a considerable amount of its reflection to questions of war and peace and violence and the need to promote peace among the nations. We also, in the 1960s, see new conflicts. The Vietnam War had broken out. There was new tensions in the Middle East. And in India, there were conflicts between India and China in the Himalayan regions, and between Pakistan and India in the Kashmir. Another sign of this growing dignity of the human person and of the recognition of the many gifts present in different cultures and traditions was the emergence of many African and Asian countries from colonial rule. India had achieved its independence in 1947, and we see just in the period of the Second Vatican Council, in the first 4 years of the 1960s, more than 20 African nations gained their independence. So certainly the bishops from these regions were very much conscious of these issues and the precarity also of these new nation states. In this next section, I want to turn our attention to the ecclesial context and to say what were the issues that were being dealt with within the Catholic Church and within the council itself as the council met. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Richard Gallardi from Boston College, has characterized the first session of the Second Vatican Council by describing it as a moment where the council almost failed. Imagine planning a meeting and you don't have an agenda. That's a little bit like what John the 23rd did. He had this inspiration. He felt that the church needed to gather together and reflect and deliberate together on the challenges of the contemporary world, but he didn't set out a fixed plan. He invited the bishops freely to suggest the themes and the topics that the council should treat. And he set up 10 subcommissions, which were paralleled to the different dicasteries of the Roman Curia, to begin drafting proposed texts that the bishops might consider when they arrived in Rome. They, of course, were to take account of the suggestions of the bishops, but in many cases, they weren't very forward-thinking. And many of the bishops, when they saw these original texts, in all there were 70 different drafts, they were very, very dissatisfied because they saw that the members of the commissions, the doctrinal commission and the other subcommissions, had really just gathered together a kind of compendium of existing teaching, repeating the council's teaching from the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council, the teachings of Pope Pius XII, but not addressing the new context, the new world situation, or translating these traditional teachings into language that could be heard and understood by contemporary people. One of the other signs of the times that that John the 23rd had also observed was the growth of the ecumenical movement. So there were 160 observers and invited guests from other Christian churches who were present at the council and who were engaging in conversation with the bishops about how, as churches, we can seek unity together, but also give common witness in the world. And the bishops coming from all these diverse cultural contexts, I mentioned the region of Southeast Asia, from Africa, from Latin America, and North America and Europe. The bishops were discovering the diversity of the church in their conversations with each other. Also, we should acknowledge the presence of the Eastern Catholic bishops, who represent 22 diverse Catholic churches with their own theological, spiritual, and canonical and liturgical traditions. So there's a kind of emerging consciousness that the church has of itself. The bishops spoke of this first session of the council as a kind of school for bishops, where they became more intensely aware of the rich diversity of the Catholic communion. And so the German theologian Karl Rahner would speak of this experience as the Catholic Church at Vatican II coming to a new awareness of itself as a world church, a truly global community with all of that diversity for the first time. And today some theologians might speak of this as an emerging sense of a new Catholicity, where unity is really enriched by this diversity. Now the bishops had to make sense of these 70 draft documents. In this dramatic first session of the council, a church that had been largely anti-modern, resisted the Enlightenment. It had also been anti-Protestant in the period leading up to the Second Vatican Council. And the bishops sought to open the church up and to be more engaged and to recognize more fully everything that was true and good in the world, in other religions, in other Christian churches. And so they expressed their dissatisfaction with these 70 draft documents, and they really asked the leaders of the commissions to rethink the posture of the church and to find a different missional stance, a different missional engagement, one that would be, in fact, much more dialogical. They acknowledged that the changing context of the modern world required that the bishops even find a new style of church teaching. And this is where I think the unique character of the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, comes into play. It desires to speak to contemporary people. This is the first time in history also that an ecumenical council meets when the ordinary baptized lay faithful are educated, literate people. And because of the means of mass communication now available to us, the 1960s is really the time where we see the first satellite communication. People could follow the events of the council instantaneously, and they were very interested. In the past, lay people would rarely read a declaration or a decree from the Council of Trent or the First Vatican Council or the great medieval councils. This was the work of, these were legislative texts for bishops and princes, but not for the lay faithful. Now the council needed to find a style to speak to all the baptized faithful. And as we'll see, Gaudium et Spes dared to address itself to all people of goodwill, not just members of the Catholic Church. So towards the end of the council, in December, the 4th of December, in fact, of 1962, Cardinal Joseph Sunens, who was the Archbishop of the Diocese of Mechelen and Brussels in Belgium, and a member of the coordinating commission. There was a small group of cardinals who were organized actually kind of late in the game, but whose job it was to help to organize the council's agenda and steer its deliberations and make some sense out of all of those 70 documents that the bishops had been so unhappy with. So Cardinal Sunens had been consulting with others in the wings and in conversation directly with Pope John the 23rd, and he had prepared a plan, a kind of agenda that would guide the future deliberations of the council. And he presented this idea in a speech that he delivered in December of 1962. And in this speech, he spoke of the need for the council to deliberate on the life of the church, first of all, ad intra, to reflect on the inner life of the church, but also to attend to the life of the church ad extra, the missional engagement of the church, our dialogue with other Christians, our dialogue with people of other faiths, but also our missional engagement and our dialogue with contemporary society and culture. And so we can see perhaps the four constitutions of the council, the dogmatic, the constitution on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation, Dei Verbum, and the dogmatic constitution on the church, Lumen Gentium, are really focused on reflecting on the inner life of the Catholic community and how it might be renewed. But how it might be renewed in service of that missional engagement. And it's really the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, Gaudium et Spes, that embodies our reflection on the outward engagement of the church in the modern world. Now, I mentioned that this first session was kind of a dramatic period, and there were a lot of people that were concerned that the bishops had been deliberating for 3 months in the city of Rome and had produced nothing. They had no text to approve at the end of these 3 months of debate. And so a Dominican theologian, Marie-Dominique Chenoux, had a kind of inspiration, an idea that he shared with his colleagues, and they consulted with some of the bishops, and his idea was accepted. He said, the bishops, before they leave the city of Rome, must say something to the world. And so he began to draft what became the text of a message to the world from the council. And this message, I think, is really kind of prophetic, because we can see in it the tone that would be adapted in Gaudium et Spes. And I just want to read briefly a selection from that text because we hear it echoed in the first article of Gaudium et Spes 4 years later. The bishops said, "We wish to convey to all people and all nations the message of salvation, united here from every nation under heaven." So they're very aware of themselves as having come together as representatives of a global community. "We carry in our hearts the anxieties of all peoples entrusted to us, the anxieties of body and soul, sorrows and desires and hopes. We turn our mind constantly toward the anxieties afflicting people today. Our concern is directed especially toward the more humble, the more poor, the weaker, and in keeping with the example of Christ, we feel compassion for the throngs of those who suffer hunger, misery, and ignorance." Now, I just want to compare that with the opening lines of Gaudium et Spes, and you can hear this echo. "The joys and hopes, the sorrows and anxieties of people today, especially those who are poor and afflicted, are also the joys and hopes, the sorrows and anxieties of the disciples of Christ, and there is nothing truly human which does not also affect them." So, the first session of the council was a really dramatic one, but the seed had been planted for this new document, which would really emerge as the document that's more than any other, a child of the council itself. Other texts were revised versions of preliminary documents that had been prepared in the preparatory period. But this text really emerged quite independently of the preparation for the council and was really given birth in the deliberations of the council itself. So, and it comes from this new ecclesial consciousness, which I think it's worth also reflecting on. It's a consciousness because of all of these movements in society and in the political and international world. Philosophers were also reflecting on how the experience of what it means to be human was changing. And that changing context of the world community and the experience of humanity also gives rise to a new ecclesial consciousness, a new sense of the Church's mission, which we see reflected in Article 55 of Gaudium et Spes, which I read here very briefly. "There is a growing number of people in every culture who are conscious of being architects and authors of culture and their own community. More than any other time in human history, humans were shaping the world in which they live. Throughout the world, there is a continual increase in the awareness of autonomy as well as of responsibility, which is of greatest significance for the spiritual and moral maturity of humankind." And so the bishops write, "Thus we are witnesses that a new humanism is being born, in which the human is defined above all in terms of our humanity and our responsibility to our sisters and brothers in history." And so you could say the Church itself is becoming newly aware of its responsibility towards our brothers and sisters in the human community and in human history. So my third section here, I want to turn our attention to the text of Gaudium et Spes, which was drafted not just by a doctrinal commission, but by a joint commission which included delegates from a commission that had been working on the apostolate of the laity. And there were lay auditors, men and women who were experts in their fields, who also contributed to the drafting of these texts. So when Gaudium et Spes writes about marriage and family life, about economic life, participation in political life and in building up society and culture, in working for justice and peace, we should know that lay leaders also, in collaboration with the bishops, made important contributions to this text. This document also is quite unique in its literary genre, And we can hear that in the title of the Constitution. It's not called a dogmatic constitution, but a pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. And unlike all the other documents from the Council, this text addresses, as I mentioned previously, all people of goodwill. And it took as its model for this Pope John the 23rd's final encyclical that was published in April of 1963, Pacem in Terris. So here's Pope John near death and aware of these dramatic events going on in the Atlantic with the Cuban Missile Crisis. He writes a letter on peace in the world, and he addresses himself a papal teaching for the first time to all people of goodwill. And the Council Fathers wanted to follow his example. Before we get into the text itself, I want to spend a moment reflecting on, again, what does it mean to say that this Constitution is a pastoral constitution? Does this mean it's not a doctrinal text? It has no weight, no doctrinal weight, as did the dogmatic constitutions on divine revelation or on the church. There's a clue to understanding the relationship to this there's a footnote appended to the first article of Gaudium et Spes. And that text reads as follows. The Constitution is termed pastoral because while it depends on the principles of doctrine, its aim is to express the relationship between the church and the world and people of today. As this pastoral aim is not absent from the first part, so the doctrinal aim is not absent from the second. When we look at the text, we're going to see it's divided into two parts. And the first part focuses really on the church's understanding of the vocation of humanity, the call to be human, the life of the human community, and the church's role in relation to the wider human community. And the second part deals on some matters of urgent concern. It names 5 of them. And some of those questions may be very much conditioned by the historical context of the 1960s, the questions of war and peace, the questions of social life and economic life. But we should not think that there's no doctrine, no doctrinal reflection in the second part because it looks at those practical issues, nor should we think that the doctrinal reflections in the first part can be divorced from the pastoral life, the practical living out of the gospel in the world. So the text itself warns us against introducing a false dichotomy or juxtaposing the doctrinal and pastoral character of the text. An important clue to understanding the nature of the pastoral character of this teaching can be found in the speech of Pope John the 23rd, delivered on the 11th of October in the opening exercises of the Council. He said to the bishops, "The salient point of this Council is not for us to discuss one article of doctrine or the other." There wasn't a big doctrinal debate. No one was debating the divinity of Christ or one of these central doctrinal issues, as had been the case in previous ecumenical councils. And so he introduced an important distinction, and he said to the bishops, the substance of the ancient doctrine of the faith is one thing, and the way in which it is presented in the other. He's saying we need to kind of be clear about distinguishing between the content of our proclamation, which doesn't change, and the form in which it takes. And he says it is the latter which must be taken into great consideration with patience if necessary. And he said we need to exercise the pastoral magisterium, the pastoral teaching office of the bishop's office in a way that the teaching's pastoral character is clear. So he's not saying we should set aside the doctrine of the church, the doctrinal tradition, but we must find a form a pastoral form, a form that will speak to contemporary people and invite them to live, to embrace the wisdom of the gospel and to live it out in their daily life. And so he's also recognizing that the bishops themselves, in the exercise of their pastoral teaching office, they have a conservative function. Their responsibility is to preserve the tradition, but they also have a creative responsibility. And in fidelity to the tradition, they're responsible to proclaim the gospel in ways that will enable it to be heard and received and embraced and lived by contemporary people. So with these preliminary remarks now, I want to spend the rest of our time looking at the text of Gaudium et Spes, and I'll begin by looking at the first part and then proceed to the second. We're going to spend most of our time looking at that foundational theology that's in the first part, and there are 5 chapters in each of these 2 parts. So some of the themes that emerge in the first part of Gaudium et Spes are, as we heard in the opening lines of the Council of the Constitution, that talk about our sharing in the joys and hopes and the anxieties and sorrows of the whole human community, is the Church's solidarity with all of humankind, and in particular, our concern and solidarity with the poor. And this section of this first part of Gaudium et Spes will also develop a kind of vision for a new humanity. And the vision and the touchstone for our aspiration to a community that's more fully human is the person of Jesus Christ, the Word of God, who embraced our humanity in the Incarnation. And so there's a strong Christological focus in the discussion of this. And this section's reflection also on the responsibilities of the Church in relationship to the world, we have a sense of, in the language of Father Chenou, that the Church is called to be in a permanent state of mission. Pope Francis is repeating this language in our time. It was used first by Marie-Dominique Chenou, who recognized the challenge or even the failure of the Church in the early 20th century to really engage with contemporary people. And the means that the Council would embrace to carry out its mission is through mutual dialogue with others. Pope Paul VI, when he was elected in June of 1963, one of his first tasks was to draft an encyclical letter on the Church, the mission of the Church in the modern world, where he really develops an extended reflection on the need for a dialogical engagement with the modern world, with other religions, with other Christian churches. So in the first 10 articles of Gaudium et Spes, we read a brief preface and introduction, as we heard, that expresses our solidarity with humankind and that says very clearly that the Church itself feels and considers itself to be part of the human family and feels deep love and concern for the whole of the human family. Some scholars have said one of the most important words in the title of Gaudium et Spes is the word "in." There's not a juxtaposition between church and world. They're not two mutually exclusive realities opposing one another, but the Church lives in the world, and it's in the world as salt or leaven. Also in Article 3, there's a strong consciousness of the fact that the Church is not an end in itself. The goal of the Church's mission is not simply the Church, but the Church exists to be of service, to serve the wider human community following the example of Christ. We also hear in these early articles, early chapters of Gaudium et Spes, this awareness of the accelerating pace of social change that raise new questions for the human community. There's a long description of the context that we saw before with both important signs of technological progress, new prosperity, but new inequities, new conflict in the world community. And the members of the Church are called to read and discern in the movements of human history the signs of God's presence. That's the meaning of this expression, the signs of the times. And the key for interpreting the presence and action of God in history is really our touchstone, Christ in the Incarnation, and Christ's model of human living. The first principle that is underlined in Part 1 and in the first chapter of Part 1 is the dignity of the human person. And so all of the Council's teaching here on our social engagement is the recognition of the dignity of every human created in the image and likeness of God. And while we have this dignity, we also recognize that every human person remains vulnerable and wounded by sin. And so we're given a great freedom. We can choose to collaborate with God's plan in history, but we can also choose not to. God leaves us free. And so there's a sense in this also of our responsibility, and a sense that we don't overcome the effects of sin in human society without the help of God's grace. This cannot be done by merely human efforts. One of the outstanding features of human dignity, the Council says in Gaudium et Spes number 19, is that all human persons have been created for communion with God and with one another, of course. And the Church is to be a sign, a sacramental expression, a prophetic witness of that living together in communion in the world. And it's in Christ where we see the perfect realization of the new humanity. This is stated in Gaudium et Spes number 22. One of the characteristics of human persons created free and in the image and likeness of God is that each human person is endowed with the gift of conscience. And this dignity is expressed in our conscience, which the Council says in Article 15 of Gaudium et Spes, is ever summoning them to love and do what is good and to avoid evil. This inner voice where we meet God is also referred to as the most intimate center and sanctuary of the person, where we are alone with God. And every person then is recognized as having a responsibility, first of all, to seek the truth, to inform our conscience, but then also to act and follow the dictates of our conscience in our decision making. Chapter 2 develops a reflection on the human community and the interdependence that people feel increasingly in the global village that people were beginning to discover more intensely in the 1960s. And the Council in Gaudium et Spes number 26 defines this notion of the common good that has been part of our doctrinal heritage and present in Catholic social teaching for over a century. The common good is the sum total of the conditions of social life which enable groups and persons to realize their perfection more fully and readily. And so it's going to call us to attend in the structures of social life, economic life, political life, to be at the service of all people, at the service of the common good. And this call to attend to the common good implies that we must always seek the correct balance between our freedom as persons created in the image and likeness of God and our responsibility towards one another. And so also in this section, we see the development of really the basic principles that will ground an ethic of justice. There's a recognition that we respect the dignity of others. That also means it goes as so far as loving our enemies. We need to transcend a culture of individualism. And the model really of our participation in society is found again in Christ and in the Paschal mystery. I find it quite remarkable that Gaudium et Spes says not just the baptized, but every human person is called to live out the Paschal mystery, to participate in the dying and rising of Christ, to reproduce the pattern of Christ's self-giving in service to others. So there's a big reflection also in chapter 3 on the nature of human activity in the world. And the Council asks us to think about to what extent are human activities contributing to the realization of God's plan in history? So there's a recognition that there's darkness and light. There are sinful structures at work, but also when we respond to the best aspirations for human life and community, we can be building up the human world, following the commandment of love and bringing about the transformation of human structures and societies in the world. Chapter 4 turns our attention to the task of the church in the modern world, and again underlines that the basic means, the primary means for carrying out our mission and service in the world is to be engaged in dialogue, in dialogue with all people who are seeking truth through their engagement in culture, in science, in technology, in economic life, in social and political life. And that the place of the church is to be a leaven in society. Again, we're in solidarity with the human community, and we're working with others for the transformation of the human community into God's family. Now there's an interesting reflection in several of the final paragraphs of Part 1 on this dialectic between the church and the world, because of course it's easy to say the church has a message to proclaim. It wants to bring good news, the good news of salvation to the world, and to contribute to the reshaping of the human family. The church wants to be that prophetic sign in the world, and everyone has a responsibility to share in that mission. That's not just the job of bishops or clergy. That's the responsibility of every baptized Christian, to be a living witness to the gospel wherever they live and work. That's not just an activity for Sunday, but really, we should be sending people forth from our parish communities every Sunday, prepared to be those living witnesses where they work, in the raising of their children, working in education, in factories. Those are the places where we're called to be leaven in the dough of humanity. And so there's a kind of complementarity of roles that's recognized within the church itself. And in Article 43, Gaudium et Spes, say lay people have a right to expect spiritual care and spiritual help from the clergy, but they shouldn't expect that their pastors, their bishops and priests, have answers to every question that they encounter in their family life, in social life, in political life. And so they too have a contribution to make. Now, after this long reflection on the responsibility of the church to bring the gospel to the world, there's a humble recognition that the church also has always in its history received from the world, receives the gifts of other cultures, receives insights from science and philosophy and other religious traditions and cultural traditions that help us understand more deeply what it means to be human. And it says remarkably, these insights disclose human nature more completely and indicate new ways to the truth, which are of much benefit to the church. And so it reminds us that the church, yes, has a message to proclaim, but also has a responsibility to listen and to discern, to always evaluate the movements of history in light of the gospel. Part 2 of Gaudium et Spes turns to some urgent problems that were confronting the world community in the 1960s. And I tried to unpack some of those in the introductory considerations of this lecture. So I'm going to go very quickly over the last 5 chapters that we find in Part 2 of Gaudium et Spes. We see them here. They treat the questions of marriage and family life. Today, we're on the eve of the Second Synod on the family in the Catholic Church in the 21st century. So we recognize there are still new challenges, new pressures to the life of couples and families in our society and culture today. Chapter 2 here will reflect on the proper development of culture. Chapter 3 on social and economic life. Chapter 4 on the life of the political community. And Chapter 5 on promoting peace. and encouraging the collaboration among the community of nations. There's some important developments in the Council's treatment of marriage and family life. And one of the questions that was debated was, what is the goal, the purpose, the end of Christian marriage? Traditional teaching had seen this primarily in terms of the procreation of children. In some of the more, for us it would seem strange and perhaps even regrettable, some of the church fathers wrote about marriage as a remedy for concupiscence, to sort of save us from the primal urges of human sexuality. But here, there's a really important recognition that an equal purpose of marriage is the unitive expression of love and mutual love between the spouses. And so the Council recognizes the complementary ends of the unitive and procreative roles of Christian marriage. Earlier in the dogmatic constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Lumen Gentium had spoken of Christian marriage and family life as the domestic church. It's the first place that we encounter Christian community, is in our Christian family experience. It's in the Christian family that we experience for the first time the love of God. Christian marriage, the covenant bond between husband and wife, is to be a sign of God's presence and God's love in the world for others. The Council speaks of both human culture and social life and reminds the baptized that we all have a responsibility to participate and to contribute to the cultural life and to the building up of society and the communities in which we live. And it talks, when it gets to speaking about economic life, it has some very strong words that we can hear continuing to echo today in the teaching of Pope Francis and in other Catholic social teachings since the Second Vatican Council. It says in Article 64 that the fundamental purpose of economic production, we see, unfortunately, economic life not in human terms today, but in terms of, it's kind of a machinistic notion of production. But it says the purpose of productivity is not just the multiplication of products. It must not be profit or domination. That's not the goal of sound economics. Rather, economic structures and processes must be aimed at the service of humanity, indeed of the whole person, viewed in terms of material needs and the demands of intellectual, moral, spiritual, and religious life. And then it goes on to say, as if to underline this even more strongly, and when we say the human person, we mean every person, every group of persons, whatever race and whatever part of the world. So no one should be excluded from a just economic system. And where there are inequities, Gaudium et Spes calls us to address these immediately. In its discussion of political life in chapter 4, Gaudium et Spes develops a reflection on the autonomy, the independence of church and society, or church and state. Both are independent of each other, both should be free and self-governing, but this doesn't mean that the church has no place in political life, or that the church cannot be a voice, a prophetic voice in issues of political concerns. And the church needs to learn how to act in so doing without aligning itself with partisan approaches to things. And so this is spelled out in Article 76, where we read, "The role and competence of the church being what it is, she must in no way be confused with the political community, nor bound to any political system." So the church isn't pro-capitalist or pro-communism or pro-socialism. The church wants to stay over and above those structures, but also call all people in political life to care for the common good, to leave no one behind, to develop structures that serve the whole human community and the flourishing of all persons. So the Church sees itself as at once a sign and safeguard of the transcendence of the human person. The Church's mission is to call us to the height of the human vocation, to be self-transcending, self-giving. The last way that the Council wants to promote in this dialogue is to promote a culture of peace. And here we can see in chapter 5 of part 2 of Gaudium et Spes the influence of Pope John XXIII's encyclical letter, Pacem in Terris, from 1963. And in its discussion of war and peace, the bishops had to even rethink that classical theory of just war, because we had seen in the conflict of the Second World War and again in the Cuban Missile Crisis the emergence of weapons of mass destruction, atomic weapons that redefine the nature of war. We had now weaponry for indiscriminate destruction of human persons, including civilian communities. And so there's much more reticent for people to promote the use of violence to resolve conflict. And the Council says in Article 80 that we must undertake an evaluation of war with an entirely new attitude in this new context. Primarily, the Council wants to encourage us to seek, of course, non-violent means of resolving conflict and promote the development of international structures for dialogue, diplomacy, and conflict resolution. So I hope these few brief comments give you an overview of the document Gaudium et Spes and will give you the desire to read it more carefully and to gain from the many rich pearls of wisdom that are there and that can continue to inform us as we strive in the 21st century to live as Christians in the contemporary world. Thank you.